April 2026. Tucker Carlson said he misled America. A federal court told the president he can't close the border by decree. And an American journalist was zip-tied and beaten in Baghdad. I'm Richard Schreiber. Tom?
Yeah, thank you, Richard. When the Fairness Doctrine fell in 1987, the law stopped requiring evidence. Opinion dressed as news filled the vacuum. That's the architecture that Tucker Carlson was built inside, and this is true journalism.
So our guest today has documented the inside of American power for over 30 years, on tape and on the record. Chris Whipple, a journalist, Emmy Peabody work at 60 Minutes and Primetime, author of The Gatekeepers, The Spymasters, The Fight of His Life Inside Biden's White House, and Uncharted. And then in December 2025, that Vanity Fair article with Susie Wiles through year one of the Trump presidency, she called it a hit piece. He said, everything is on tape. It's all there. Welcome, Chris. We're so happy and pleased as punch, as Truman Capote used to say, to have you on the show. Always that Liberace.
Good to be with you.
Yeah,
Awesome.
Thanks, Chris. It's I was going to say it's funny, but maybe that's not the right adjective to use. But when a podcast episode is recorded, some people might listen to it the next day, some might listen to it 3 months later, and so on. But at the time that we're recording this, it's less than 24 hours after the White House Correspondents' Dinner in Washington, D.C. at the Hilton Hotel, where I had tuned into CNN, as I often do, to hear the humor and the jovial exchange between whatever the current president and the White House, various news organizations. But it did not unfold that way at all. It was yet another assassination attempt, apparently. And following that, people were putting, again, I'm a social media addict, I will admit, people were saying, did it really happen? What was it all about? What does it mean? Questions started rolling through my head. Is this kind of a reflection of the polarized state that America's in, or was it just a crazed individual? And in all of your books and interviews, you do such a great job of kind of assessing what the pulse is. What are people thinking? What does it really mean for all of us? And I just would love to hear your thoughts about all of that.
Thanks, Tom. First of all, maybe one thing we could all agree on is that the White House Correspondents' Dinner is just a really bad idea. At least in this day and age, before we had any idea what was going to happen this time around, I think it was obvious that the question in my mind is, on what planet does it make sense for the White House press corps to be breaking bread with a president who has declared the press to be the enemy of the people, who has prosecuted journalists for doing their job, and who has demonstrated over and over again that he regards them as the enemy.
Yeah.
So I think I just don't know what purpose it serves, and I think it's also just a bad look in general for both Trump, but also for the press corps. When you have a period that we're living through right now with such distrust of the establishment, such contempt for the elites, I think this just plays right into that feeling. And you could hardly blame people for thinking these are a bunch of overpaid, overprivileged journalists who are yucking it up on our dime, even if it's not taxpayer money. It's just too cozy. So and then of course, there's the whole question of what happened with the apparent attempted assassination.
Parent, yeah.
Where the security was adequate. Anyway, just a bad idea, and I'm glad I didn't.
Yeah, I hear it. So, Richard, if you'll indulge me with a follow-up question.
Yeah.
You say the White House press corps, and then I promise you'll have the next question. But again, Richard and I recorded a number of these episodes, again, assessing what is the state of the news media these days. There's certain annoyances and concerns and so on. And what you just mentioned reminds me of something I often talk about. I don't like to sound like an old guy ranting, oh man, you should have been here 20 years ago. But I look at what's happening at CBS News right now, and I know that you and I have some friends in common still there at CBS News, and I really respect them. They do excellent work. But this whole movement of Larry Ellison's family purchasing Paramount, the FCC chairman acting somebody from Goodfellas or something, and then the cozy relationship. I've never met Barry Weiss, but I just don't like what's happening from a distance. And so when you talk about that cozy relationship, what do you make of that?
It's hard not to conclude that this whole Skydance merger or takeover, whatever you want to call it, is just flat out corrupt. They are all saying the quiet part out loud, including pretty recently when Pete Hegseth said to, I believe, to one of the CBS Pentagon correspondents, "Man, I can't wait until you're under new management," or words to that effect. It's obvious that CBS seems to be doing everything in its power to demonstrate to Trump that we're going to be nice to you. We're going to pull punches in return for approval of this merger by Skydance. And I know that what David Ellison has said that I gather he said words to the effect that he will not be interfering in editorial decisions. But in the same breath, we're hearing the Trump administration saying they can't wait for this guy to get in there and change and tell CBS and perhaps CNN as well what to cover and how to cover it. So it's a really, I think, almost corrupt situation.
Yeah. And they're trying to cloak it behind claims that CBS Radio, 60 Minutes are legacy products that no longer are the sign of the times, and that changes have to be made, when in practicality, they're talking about editorial changes. That, some of 60 Minutes pieces that are directly critical of organizations or billionaires that support the Trump administration or their advertisers or whatnot. What 60 Minutes was built on, with Mike Wallace and Dan Rather and people like that over the years, they're just defanging 60 Minutes or any news organization that in any way would be critical not only of Trump and the administration, but any of his billionaire cronies.
Although having sounded pretty negative up to this point, I would say that I've been around long enough to remember when Larry Tisch came in and took over CBS, and the next thing we knew, Don Hewitt, the executive producer, spiked a huge investigative piece on the tobacco industry. That piece ultimately aired, but it was a real black eye for CBS, but they got past it. And it aired to devastating effect. And in fairness to Barry Weiss, that piece on the CCOT detention center in El Salvador also aired maybe a few weeks later, but perhaps to much more exposure than it might have gotten had she not yanked it. I think that I'm the glass half full guy when it comes to 60 Minutes surviving this. But these are tough times.
Yeah, and the Stephen Colbert interview that was pulled by Barry Weiss with the Democratic senatorial candidate in Texas, that subsequently he did it on YouTube and bettered his ratings. That was a bit of a cautionary tale, and I believe an overreach.
Yeah.
Because ironically quoting the fairness doctrine, which we know is repealed under the Reagan days. So CBS, it was not incumbent upon them to provide equal time for Trump or for the opposing candidate on the Republican side, just because he was planning to interview. And they don't do that when he has the esteemed senator from Vermont, right, on his program. You don't see the Republicans screaming about equal time when Bernie Sanders gets on. I want to ask you a question about Bernie Sanders, Chris, but he's obviously in many ways, the lone voice. And here in New York, we have a representative, also AOC, who's also pretty outspoken, and they've gone on road shows together. But I find it curious that Bernie Sanders seems to have total access to talk about some of the things that are on people's minds, and healthcare and AI and everything else. But no one on the right seems to want to interfere with him, which I find curious in the current climate. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't know. It's hard for me to get inside their heads on that. Why I can only presume that it's because they don't regard Bernie Sanders as a threat to be the nominee in 2028. But I think there's no question about it that you think about AOC, Mamdani, Bernie Sanders, they have a real following. They are resonating for a reason. It's authenticity and it's the power of their message. Again, they've tapped into this feeling among, and to some extent, Rahm Emanuel's making some of the same points, I think.
Yeah, Chicago.
Which is that, you know what? Trump is right. The system is rigged, just not the way he tells you.
Tells him.
And I think there's a tremendous backlash against the establishment of both parties. And I think in 2028, we're really likely, if some outsider is really likely to tap into that. I think it's a moment, the aftermath of Richard Nixon. Think about when Jimmy Carter ran 76 and he ran as an outsider. He was against the elites. He promised he would never lie to you and swept into office. I think we're looking at a similar mood in the country.
You're much more of an expert than I am on this, but it does seem like there's a state of turmoil across the board. Think of your most recent book about Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, and Donald Trump. Yeah. It's like, I'm tempted to ask what you think of is the future for the Democratic Party. But again, that outsider idea is quite interesting. We have a little over 2 years now, or I guess less than 2 years from their candidacy campaign. But Kamala's making rumblings about running again. I know you've spoken a lot about how did the inner circle there, you've interviewed so many members and know so many members there, especially of the Biden years, as well as Trump years, of course, but how the Biden circle let things get to that point. So it's no opportunity to win at all.
Yeah, they tied their hands.
Again, I do not subscribe. On the other hand, I don't subscribe to the Jake Tapper thesis that Joe Biden was Woodrow Wilson, that he was non-compos mentis and sitting in the corner while some cabal was running the country by autopen. I think it's nonsense. Joe Biden had his wits about him. He was making decisions behind closed doors. He was perfectly capable of being president up to the day that he announced that he was stepping aside. What he couldn't do was campaign. And that's the story I tell in Uncharted, which is my book about the 2024 election, the wildest in history, at least since 1968.
Yep.
Again, we could talk all day about Biden and his advisors. I would just say that a number of them were just in this kind of fog of delusion.
Yeah.
But I'm here to tell you that some of them really believe that Joe Biden would have won that election. We're talking about Mike Donilon and Steve Ricchetti and his closest aides. Ron claimed until his first White House chief of staff, right up to the last minute, thought that they could somehow rally all the progressives and get them out on the White House lawn, and Biden would sail on to the nomination and win the election. And it was just stunning, the level of just wishful thinking among Biden's advisors. But very different from the Tapper proposition that he was this menace.
Yeah, it's like the last 2 years of the Reagan administration where Nancy and her tarot cards were making key decisions.
Yeah, much longer than and she was doing that for much longer than anybody realized.
Yeah. Chris, I want to talk about, obviously, the interview that you did with Susie Wiles, but you documented through your Gatekeepers documentary, every chief of staff since Nixon. What did you learn about the gap between how power is exercised and how it's sold?
The Gatekeepers, as you mentioned, began as a documentary on the Discovery Channel back in 2013, I believe it was. And then I felt that I just had to write the book because I was just in getting to know every living White House chief of staff, and there were, I think, 17 of them at the time, from Howard Baker, who was still alive at that point, all the way up to now Susie Wiles, of course. What I discovered, to my astonishment, was that the White House chief of staff can make the difference between success and failure for every presidency.
Wow.
And that's how critical the job is. There would have been no Reagan Revolution without James A. Baker III.
Yeah.
Right out of the blocks, Reagan was determined to tackle Social Security, to dismantle it, slash it. And Baker got Nancy Reagan. He rallied some allies and he sat the president down and he said, Mr. President, Social Security is the third rail of American politics. You touch it, you'll be electrocuted. Let's pivot to the economy, to tax cut. Reagan did, and the rest is history. I think, just to give one more example, that Bill Clinton would have been a one-term president if they hadn't brought in Leon Panetta as White House Chief of Staff a year and a half into his first term. Clinton was dead in the water. And they knew they needed a real disciplinarian, and not easy to find somebody who can discipline Bill Clinton. Yes. But they found and Leon it's a great story, and I write about it in The Gatekeepers, my book. But Panetta loved being OMB director, which he was at the time, didn't want to be White House Chief of Staff, knew it was thankless and relentless and all the rest. They had to basically take him to Camp David and lock him in a cabin until he would agree to be White House Chief of Staff. And then he became, I would say, along with Jim Baker, the gold standard. So anyway, to me, the extraordinary thing was just to learn just how important that position is. These guys are unelected and unconfirmed, but they are crucial. And Susie Wiles, I would argue, absolutely is the same story. Donald Trump, number one, would not be president without her. She was that important as his presidential campaign manager. But beyond that, she is without a doubt the second most powerful person in the White House and the only person that Donald Trump trusts.
Wow. That's saying a lot. And yet Rahm Emanuel said it was a thankless job, I guess, when he did it for Barack Obama. Go figure.
Rahm Emanuel was a fantastic interview. My friend David Kennerly said that he did a 3-hour interview in an hour and a half. You know, he's that wound up. But he was a good one for Obama. He was his first White House Chief of Staff. And you're right, he gives this description. He said, it's like having wind shear. It's like you're going through re-entry, coming back from the moon. It burn. You don't know up from down. He says it's absolutely relentless. And yet, would I do it again? And you ask every White House Chief of Staff if they do it again, and they would do it again if asked.
Wow.
Yeah, heartbeat. Yeah.
It's very interesting.
Maybe not Don Regan.
He ran afoul from Nancy pretty quickly.
You're speaking of, and again, we just have there's a couple more questions. We really appreciate your time. When you mention who can bring bad news to the president or splash that cold water on, wake up to reality here, I know you're saying that Susie Wiles is a stabilizing force, and I know you said that she suggested some things like that he has not followed, like maybe we should pardon across the board the January 6th
insurrectionists. Yeah.
And is there anyone else? Again, Rich and I often in these conversations, we look back on the Nixon era. Republican leaders came to the White House and said, "It's over, man."
Yeah, very Goldwater.
Very Goldwater, yes.
Yeah.
Is there any remote prospect of that in the Trump administration? I can't imagine that right now.
There's not. The bad news is that no one in the White House, including Susie Wiles, seems able to walk into the Oval Office, close the door, and tell Donald Trump what he doesn't want to hear. That's the most important part of the job. Susie is fascinating to me. I think she's one of the most fascinating people in American politics, not only because she helped to get Trump elected, but because of her unique relationship with him. She's very smart. She's savvy. She also understands the history of the job, and she understands what she's supposed to be doing. She understands.
And what she's not supposed to be doing. Yeah.
She understands that it's her job to tell the president hard truths. And so she would like you to believe that she does. But at the end of the day, I think she's realized that with Donald Trump, you can't. And if you read my Vanity Fair piece, which is almost 10,000 words, you can trace the evolution of her in the beginning, telling me she was wide-eyed and enthusiastic about becoming White House chief, and she told me how Trump was going to be a completely different.
Yep.
She told me that they had a deal that within 90 days he would stop the
retribution. Yeah.
retribution campaign. 6 months into it, I asked her, whatever happened to that?
Yeah.
She said, you can't blame him. These people were out to get him. And I think she's given up on telling the president hard truths. And the White House chief is uniquely positioned to do that. It's bad news when the White House chief cannot.
Yeah. And I noticed some of her responses, and you asked her some really pointed questions, like about the cabinet selection. And it occurred to me, and those of us who try to be impartial, when we look at Pam Bondi and Kristi Noem, Kash Patel, Pete Hegseth, from an objective perspective, not even getting into their viewpoints, they just don't seem qualified for their positions. Yet Susie made a statement that she thought the cabinet selections were top of the line. And I just scratched my head on that. Is that her just towing the party line? And to your point, giving up?
I take her at her word. I felt that she was incredibly unguarded and candid with me for whatever reason. People can draw their own conclusions.
Yes.
But for whatever reason, she was very open with me, and I think truthful. I think she was convinced that I was going to give her a fair hearing. She almost seemed to think that she could persuade me that how righteous the cause was. I honestly think she thought she could. And so I think I take her at her word when she said that this is the most, I think she said words to the effect of, this is the best cabinet in history. And on paper, obviously, it's the farthest thing from it. And certainly
conduct also.
And in practice as well. But she's all in, I think, on MAGA. She mostly, but not in an ideological way. She believes in Donald Trump. And I think, therefore, she believes he should have a cabinet populated by people who will execute his agenda. No questions asked.
Do you have time for a couple more questions?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, great. And this might be shifting gears a little bit, but again, something else that Richard and I often talk about on these conversations is the apparently transactional nature of our president and some of the people that work with him. Again, look at what's happening in the Middle East. Just a few years ago, Jared Kushner started an investment fund, and suddenly $2 billion is floating in. I can't get out of my head the idea of the journalists is at Khashoggi being dissected in the embassy. It's like, where are things going if the president and his family launching a cryptocurrency fund with hundreds of millions of dollars trickling in? I can't imagine seeing this in any other presidency, and still we see this again and again. I don't know what to make of it.
It's just out there for everybody to see. It's just so obvious. It's almost unbelievable. But what I think it speaks to is that these are people who make no distinction between their business and even their family business and running the country. They just don't understand the idea of guardrails or conflicts of interest. I just think that's a language they do not speak. When I got to know Jared Kushner pretty well, and I've spoken to him quite a lot, almost always off the record. When I asked him about Khashoggi, who was brutally murdered at the hands of the Saudis, and the CIA concluded that MBS that gave the order, in effect, his reply was, he lives in a tough neighborhood. And I think if you were to press Kushner on the idea of carrying out diplomacy with countries with which he's making business deals, I think he would just say, what do you mean? What's the conflict?
Exactly.
I just don't think they understand.
Yeah. And then Trump's two sons are reported to be investing in a drone corporation that manufactures drones in Israel that they intend to sell back to the Pentagon for use in the Iran war. So yeah, the lines of demarcation, and there's been a lot about how the Trump family has enriched themselves in the year and change that Trump has been in office, which again is really unusual, certainly throughout our history. Even Dick Cheney had to apparently detach from Halliburton when he was vice president. I don't know what extent that was, but yeah, there are no lines of demarcation at all with these folks. And the $2 billion that Jared Kushner got from the Saudis, some people say was for his positive ushering in the Saudis during the first Trump administration, protecting them and making sure that their needs were met. But anyway, we normally do a segment at the end called The Wire, where we just quickly talk about the top 5 stories, if you want to stick around for that. And we would love to pick this up with a kind of a second half of our segment in overtime. If you have maybe another few minutes to stay on with us, we'd love to keep you on. All righty. So this week, the top 5, the first story is about Tucker Carlson, who apologized on his podcast saying, "I'm sorry I misled you for voting for Donald Trump." Of course, the administration said Tucker is a nut job, and we all know the history with he and Fox News, which led to the $800 billion settlement against Fox News regarding the voting machines. But his criticism is only narrowly focused on the Iran war, which I found is interesting. And whereas Lauren Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene have focused on the Epstein files. So it seems, is this just a case, we all know Tucker Carlson, is that just a case of trying to make a name for himself, fill a vacuum, or should we be paying attention?
I think what it tells you is that Tucker Carlson is running for president. I think what it tells you is that J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio both have Iran as a huge liability.
Yeah.
It's going to be wrapped around their necks if either one wants to be nominated in 2028, it's going to be extremely difficult when they're tied. Think about Kamala when they're tied to this policy. Think about when Kamala Harris could not distance herself from Joe Biden's policy in Gaza. This is that problem 10.0.
Yeah.
So Tucker Carlson sees an opening here.
Yeah, no, he's going for it. And then the Iran peace talks theater and what that's all, how that's unraveling, where Kushner and Witkoff were supposed to go to Islamabad for peace talks, but that was called off. And there's obviously, we've reported in the past, Chris, there's this dichotomy between what Trump is reporting and what the Iranians are reporting. And the late night talk show hosts have had a field day with that, saying that the Iranian press is probably arguably more accurate than our own president.
Colbert said, should we listen to a fascistic, despotic leader, or should we listen to the Iranians or something? Yeah, that was very polite, but and then of course on Easter, do you think, I know it's speculation obviously, but do you think Donald Trump is losing his grip a little bit? Again, the tweet on Easter, we're going to devastate your civilization or something, throw you back to the Stone Age.
In the words of Winston Churchill, if there's a strategy at work here, it's exceedingly well disguised. I don't think there's any evidence that there's any plan here. Yeah. This is vintage Trump.
Yeah.
And that is, you particularly emboldened by what happened in Venezuela. He thinks he can just roll in, blow stuff up, and leave town, and somehow it'll all work out.
Yeah.
And I think he was quoted, I think, by the New York Times telling Tucker Carlson, it always works out. So to the extent there's any strategy, that's it.
Yeah, they can always taco his strategy if the polls or the stock market isn't quite responding.
One of the commentators or show hosts I enjoyed listening to or watching on CNN is Michael Smerconish. And he said a couple of weeks ago, I told Richard about this, he said, a lot of you think that Donald is just, one comedian said, I think John Mulaney said, like a horse in the airport. I've never seen a horse leave, but what's going to happen? But he said, Donald is actually very strategic because he's such a good deal maker that he wants people to worry. He was threatening we're going to storm into Greenland and all of that. He's actually much more strategic than that. I am a little skeptical about that.
Put me in that company.
Okay.
It's almost never
Yeah.
three-dimensional chess.
Yeah, no, they're talking about four-dimensional chess now these days. So another item as we quickly wrap up our session here is the federal court's appeal Trump's asylum ban as being unconstitutional. That they called an invasion an invasion response, and vowing to appeal. And again, that's been the pattern with executive orders that are quasi-unconstitutional and or can be challenged as unlawful. And just a continuous pattern, Chris, is that's likely going to continue for the next 2.5 years, I would imagine.
One of the most interesting things that Susie Wiles told me, and again, readers can judge whether to believe it or not, but I pressed her specifically on whether Donald Trump would, in the end, obey decisions by the Supreme Court. And she said, absolutely, he would. And then she added, but we think that he's going to win many more cases than anybody thinks. Look, infamously, the court made up this doctrine of immunity for presidents. The court has certainly bent over backwards to favor Trump in many ways.
Yeah.
I think that's not going to be 100%. I do think they're going to want to be careful not to be seen as completely enthralled. And for example, on birthright citizenship, I think clearly it seems they're going to use that to push back on the Trump agenda. And we'll see about the other issues.
Yeah, are they going to burn the Parliament House in Berlin, the Reichstag, like the Nazis did, as a signal that it's over? Because the question on that is, at what point does the Supreme Court realize that if they do rule in his favor too many times and in too many ways, continue increasing his power scope, that marginalizes them and even leads them to a point where Trump could abolish the Supreme Court? Their own self-existence, their self-preservation, I'm wondering how much of that plays a factor.
Yeah.
All righty. Chris, you spent 30 years proving that tape recorder as a source willing to go on record still holds power accountable. And so that's true journalism really at its core and its oldest. So we want to thank you for being on our program today, and stick around. We have a little overtime if we can continue the conversation a little bit further. And again, thank you so much for your time. It's my privilege and honor.
Yeah. Thank you, Chris. Very insightful. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
So we'll sign off here. Good night and good luck in the ominous words of Edward R. Murrow, and stick around for a little bit of overtime.
That's great. Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, folks, welcome back. Now time for overtime with our special guest, Chris Whipple.
Okay, then let us.
Hey, I did have a question. Yeah, I wasn't sure if we were going to extract some of what we were put it as a standalone segment. And I was thinking, okay, here's the question. I'd love to hear your thoughts about the future. Again, I grew up in a journalist family. My dad was a newspaper editor. I remember him bringing home a dozen newspapers to look at every day and make sure they weren't missing anything, whether he was at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution or the Miami Herald or Say Today. And so I certainly grew up with a respect for journalism, and he taught me we may not be elected representatives, but we have an ethical and moral responsibility to look for the people to shine a light. And also on these conversations, I try to be very careful and not just leap right into bashing Donald Trump. Like maybe there's some points to praise him. I'm open to that idea. Always try to find them and that kind of thing. But he has certainly gone into this hypnotic pattern. It's funny, one of these motivational speakers who Richard and I liked is Tony Robbins. He talks about the power of mantras. He says it's like self-talk, maybe like pro athletes and whatnot. And so he's been using the fake news mantra for years now, as well as rigged election, even though 60 courts have decided, no, there's nothing to that. Where are people being hypnotized in this country? Where are we headed? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, this has been happening now we're in the 11th year of the age of Trump. It's inflicted extraordinary damage. But I also think, and again, I told you before, I'm sometimes the glass half full guy. I think there's an awful lot of really good journalism still going on out there. On the plus side, many more platforms than ever. On the minus side, maybe not nearly as many resources as some of the great institutions of the 60s and 70s and 80s. I grew up in a journalism family too. My dad was an editor of the Weekly Life magazine back in the glory days of news magazines. So yeah, and he always referred to it as the fourth estate. And so on.
Yep.
I inhaled that around the dinner table. I still believe in the cause, and I still see an awful lot of good work being done out there. So I think we'll get through this. We came through it, and I remember the bicentennial in '76, thinking, "Wow, we made it through Vietnam and Watergate." So this is not the first big challenge we faced, and I think we're going to come out the other side.
Yeah, and actually, I don't know, if I can have another question and toss it to you, Richard. It's funny looking for, I don't know if that old story popped in or joke popped into my head. Ronald Reagan loves the one about the kid looking for the pony in the pile of yes. And so it's Barry Weiss told the staff, or what remains of the staff at CBS News, the times are changing now. If we don't just evolve, my God, what's going to happen to this institution? I was wondering, maybe I don't really like anything he's doing, but is there some truth to that? And again, my dad was editor one of the papers he was editor of was, like I said, the Journal and Constitution. They don't have a print edition anymore. So much has become digital. We all becoming more adept, including we can have our AI assistant gather the stories we're interested in, or probably keep those that we're not interested in from us. But how much of, I guess that's just the way it always works, right? Is things move along, that journalism will evolve, but I like the optimism that
US has survived challenges before.
Okay.
When alien organisms come into CBS, they're often rejected. Doesn't end well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love the fourth estate analogy because I grew up in high school watching the Watergate trials. That was my history class. And the story about Barry Goldwater walking into Nixon's office during the impeachment trial, and Nixon asking, "How many votes do I have on my side?" And Barry Goldwater said, "Mr. President, only 3, and one of them isn't mine."
Yeah.
And of course, contrasting to where we are today. So I think the real question that I have, Chris, is do you think journalism still has enough institutional credibility to close the gap between what your reporting is and what Bob Woodward does on recording it on tape for all to hear and see versus this manufactured narrative, this propaganda that we hear from both sides? I'm not going to assail Fox News because I think it's all over. It's a sad testament today that sometimes you have to go to Al Jazeera just to get what's actually happening in the Middle East because the rest of the press are kept at arm's length, and B, you can't trust some of the mainstream reporting other than Christina Amanpour and people like that. But yeah, kind of an extension to Tom's point. How do we get back on track?
I think you get back on track just by doing great journalism. I don't have anything more profound than that to suggest. But I think, again, as I say, I think there's some great journalists out there doing terrific work, and I think that presidents have discovered that there's a limit to how much they can get away with, and I think it's just telling stories truthfully in a nonpartisan way, as I've always tried to do in my career, is really the only antidote I can think of.
Yeah. And we miss those White House correspondents like Sam Donaldson and Dan Rather and others who really held the presidents accountable. Today, they control the media, minimize those kind of people. Although we've seen Caitlin and from CNN and others ask the difficult questions, but then they get thrown back in your face. The president doesn't like that, or you're asking questions that make him upset. And
That's the worst things coming out of his mouth. Yeah, I noticed, Chris, I noticed on a lot of your posts on Facebook, and I got the impression, I guess I hadn't heard any of these stories, but the Caitlin Collins has come under criticism from some peers. I don't know. I like her work. I am a CNN addict these days. But you said that you and your wife were at the legendary Vanity Fair post-Oscar party, and Caitlin was there and so on. What was that?
Jimmy Kimmel was there. There weren't a lot of journalists, but they were there.
That's great. That's great.
Both in good spirits.
Yeah.
And I think, don't forget that there's a reason why Trump's approval rating is in the high 30s at best at this point, and that every indication is that the coming midterm is going to be just a real drubbing.
Yeah.
So I think we can get carried away by the notion that the president is somehow all powerful and he has this megaphone that drowns out everybody else. But it's not true. And I think we're going to probably discover that in November.
Wow. No, I think I'm done with questions, but Richard.
Yeah, no, I think any question that we haven't asked of you, Chris, that you would want to share about. If our Merle was alive today, what would he be recording on?
I think Murrow would be, first of all, I think he would be apoplectic about Ukraine, the failure of this administration to stand up for Ukraine, and I think Trump's coziness with Putin.
Yeah,
I'm sure would be at the top of Murrow's list of things he'd be really pissed off about.
for sure. Again, thank you for sticking around with us on Overtime, Chris. A real privilege and honor to spend some time with you today. Again, thank you. This is Richard Schreiber.
Tom Martin, and thank you, Chris Whipple. And look for Chris's books. They're amazing and
Yes.
highly recommended. Thanks for spending time with us. We really appreciate it.
And we'll share all of that information in our podcast so you can get this. All right. God bless.
Really appreciate it. Okay, see you again soon. Thank you.
Take care, Chris.